At my daughter's memorial service, her husband leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Relax, old man. She's gone. That money is mine now, every last cent of it." Before I could turn to face him, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A text from a number I didn't recognize. 5 words. "Dad." I heard what he said. In that moment, standing in a room full of flowers and grief, I understood. She hadn't died at all. And together, we were about to bring down everything he'd built on lies. I never thought I'd be planning my daughter's funeral at 64. That's not the natural order of things. You expect to hold your children at the beginning of life, not stand over an empty casket at the end of it. But there I was, on a gray February morning in Burnaby, British Columbia, surrounded by Claire's co-workers and neighbors and people I barely recognized, staring at a framed photograph of my daughter instead of a body, because her body was never found. The RCMP said she went off the Sea to Sky highway near Squamish on the night of January 28th. Her car broke through the guardrail on a curve above the Squamish River. Witnesses reported seeing taillights disappear into the darkness below. Search and rescue spent 4 days in the water before the river corridor was declared too dangerous and the search was suspended. Presumed dead. That was the official language. Presumed. Claire was 39 years old. A senior financial advisor at a wealth management firm in Vancouver's West End. She ran marathons. She called me every Sunday morning without fail, usually from whatever coffee shop she'd stopped at after her long run. She was meticulous, careful, sharp in a way that sometimes made me feel like the child in our conversations. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, both of which I had loved unreservedly. My wife, Margaret, had passed 3 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer, quick and brutal, gone in 7 months. When Claire called me from the hospital the morning Margaret died, she said, "Dad, it's just us now. We have to take care of each other." I held on to those words through everything that followed. I held on to them as I sat in the 3rd row of the Burnaby Community Center that February morning, watching her husband of 6 years accept condolences. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 42, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that fills a room without effort. I had never fully trusted him, though I couldn't explain why. There was always something slightly rehearsed about his warmth, as if he'd learned charm the same way some people learn a second language. Functional, but never quite fluent. Claire had met him at a sailing club in West Vancouver 5 years before their wedding. She was smitten quickly, and I tried to be happy for her. At the memorial, Marcus stood near the entrance, greeting people with a handshake and a somber nod, occasionally touching the corner of his eye with one finger. His brother, Derek, stood nearby. The two of them exchanged glances every few minutes, in a way I couldn't name but couldn't dismiss. The service was a slideshow and a few speakers, and a poem Claire had loved since university. I sat in my row with my hands on my knees, watching Marcus rather than the photographs. His grief was performed well, but grief is something I know intimately. I spent 7 months learning its texture, its weight, the way it moves through a body like cold water through a house with no insulation. What I saw in Marcus Webb was not grief. It was impatience wearing grief's clothing. After the speakers finished and people began to drift toward the tables of food and coffee, Marcus made his way to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. I let him. "Arthur," he said, "you holding up all right?" "I'm managing." He glanced around the room, then lowered his voice just enough that only I could hear. "You don't need to worry about any of the financial arrangements. I'll handle all of it." He squeezed my shoulder once. "She's gone, old man. That money is mine now, every last cent of it. You just focus on resting." The words hit me somewhere between the chest and the throat. I turned to look at him, but his expression had already returned to somber and appropriate. He patted my shoulder twice more and moved away toward Derek. I sat very still for a moment. Then my phone buzzed. An unknown number. 5 words on the screen. "Dad." I heard what he said. My hands were not entirely steady as I typed back, "Who is this?" 3 seconds passed. "Don't call. Don't react. Meet me Thursday. The Tim Hortons on Kingsway near Patterson, 7 a.m. Come alone." I pressed the phone against my thigh and looked across the room at Marcus, who was laughing softly at something Derek had said. I looked at Claire's photograph on the display board. Marathon finish line, arms raised, face wide open with exhaustion and joy. Presumed dead. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the house on Gilmore Avenue that Margaret and I had bought in 1991, in the bed I hadn't shared with anyone in 3 years, staring at the ceiling. By 4 in the morning I had made a decision. I would not grieve yet. I would wait until Thursday, and then I would know. The following morning I drove across the bridge to Vancouver General Hospital. If something had gone wrong with the accident report, if the timeline of Claire's disappearance had any inconsistencies, a medical professional might have noticed. I had called ahead and asked to speak with someone from the emergency team who had been on shift the night they recovered the car. Dr. Sarah Huang met me in a small consultation room off the main corridor. She had the efficient, careful manner of someone who chose her words with awareness of their weight. When I told her I was Claire Webb's father, she offered her condolences and asked how she could help. "I need to understand the timeline," I said. "Her car went into the river around 11 at night. When did the RCMP report it?" She looked at the notes she'd pulled. The call came in at 11:47, but the vehicle wasn't located until early the following morning. The water conditions that night were significant, and no body. The current in that section of the Squamish River is substantial in January. It's not uncommon in circumstances like this. She paused. "Is there something specific you're looking for, Mr. Delaney?" "The witnesses who saw the car go over. Were there statements taken?" "That would be RCMP jurisdiction. But as I understand it, there was one witness, a driver who saw taillights and reported it from the next pullout. One witness. I thanked her and drove to the RCMP detachment in Squamish that afternoon. The duty officer was professional and sympathetic, and told me the investigation was still open and that they appreciated my patience. When I asked about the witness, he said the statement had been taken and was part of the active file. I asked if the witness had provided a name, and he told me politely that he couldn't share that information with me. On my way back down Highway 99, I pulled into a rest area and sat with the engine running, watching the gray river below. One witness, a car that went over in the dark, no body recovered. A husband who had whispered about money before the flowers at the memorial had wilted. I thought about Margaret's life insurance policy, the one that had taken us months to navigate after she died. I thought about the joint accounts Claire had mentioned when she called me last fall, asking offhand questions about how inheritance worked in BC, whether a spouse could access RRSP accounts after death, what probate timelines typically looked like. She had framed it as professional curiosity. She was a financial advisor after all. Now I wondered. I drove back to Burnaby and looked up the property records for the house Claire and Marcus owned in North Vancouver. Purchased 2019, assessed at approximately $1.4 million. Then I looked at what I knew of Claire's professional life. Senior advisor position, solid salary, a firm that paid annual bonuses. Margaret's estate had passed to Claire directly because I had insisted on it. I knew the number. Just over $400,000. Most of it in Claire's registered accounts now. And Claire had mentioned, the year before she married Marcus, that she was thinking about increasing her life insurance. She'd said something about wanting to make sure Dad was protected if anything happened to her. I had told her not to be morbid. I had no idea what the policy was worth now. I was beginning to. Thursday arrived with a low sky and the particular damp cold that settles into Vancouver in February and does not leave until April. I was at the Kingsway Tim Hortons by 10 to 7 with a coffee I didn't drink, sitting at a table by the window facing the door. She came in at 7:05 wearing a dark parka with the hood up, a toque pulled low, sunglasses despite the absence of sun. She moved to my table and sat down across from me without removing any of it. I looked at my daughter's face and did not cry, because I was afraid that if I started I would not stop, and we were in a public place, and she had told me not to react. "Hi, Dad," she said quietly. For a long moment I could not speak. "You need to listen," she said. "I know this is a shock. I'm going to explain everything, and then you're going to understand why it had to be this way." I nodded. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she'd brought to the table. "Marcus has been stealing from me for 2 years. Not small amounts. I started noticing discrepancies in our joint accounts 18 months ago. Small at first, transfers I didn't recognize. Then larger ones routed through a numbered company he set up with Derek." She kept her voice low and even. "When I started looking more carefully, I found the whole structure. They built it over 2 years. The plan was to drain the accounts slowly until there wasn't enough left to make the life insurance worth investigating, then make it look like I had an accident. Natural causes or a crash. something that wouldn't raise questions. My throat tightened. He was going to kill you. He was going to kill me. Yes. She said it without trembling, which told me she had already passed through the terror of it and come out the other side into something colder and more deliberate. I found a chain of messages on a device he thought I didn't know about, him and Derek planning it out. Which stretch of highway? What time of year? How to manage the insurance claim without triggering a fraud audit. When did you find this? October. I spent 3 months documenting everything before I made a move. I photographed every message, copied every financial record, had an independent forensic accountant verify the transfers. She looked at me steadily. And then I called you. I stared at her. Claire, I don't remember. I know. Something shifted in her expression. That's the part I need to tell you carefully. Dad, I called you on January 19th. We talked for almost 2 hours. We made the plan together. You agreed to everything. I agreed to. The accident. The memorial. Playing the grieving father while I gathered what we still needed. She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. But then I found out he'd been adding something to your tea. Whenever you came to dinner at our house. A compound that affects short-term memory consolidation. Nothing permanent, but enough to make certain things blurry. He wasn't just planning to get rid of me, Dad. He was softening you up, too. Making sure that if you remembered anything, you'd doubt yourself. The dinners at their house. The heaviness I'd felt afterward, which I'd blamed on the drive across the bridge and the lateness of the hour. The way the weeks between Christmas and the accident had felt somehow compressed, like pages torn from a calendar. Dr. Huang can confirm it if you're willing to give a hair sample, Claire said. I've been in contact with her. She knew? At the hospital? She knows now. I reached out to her on Tuesday. She's agreed to cooperate. Claire looked at me carefully. The fog will clear, Dad. I promise. Some of it already has, hasn't it? Since you stopped going to our house for dinner? I thought about it. The past 2 weeks had felt sharper than the ones before, despite everything. I had assumed that was grief sharpening my attention. Maybe it was simply the absence of whatever he'd been putting in my cup. What do we need to do? I asked. She almost smiled. It looked like her mother. We need Marcus to confess. The plan she had built was careful and patient, the way Claire built everything. She had been staying in a furnished apartment in New Westminster, under a name I won't repeat here. A colleague from her firm, a woman she trusted absolutely, had been her only contact in the outside world since January 28th. The staged accident had been arranged with the help of a retired RCMP officer who was now a private investigator, a man named Gerald Tremblay who had spent 20 years in financial crimes and understood exactly what they were dealing with. Tremblay had already brought the financial documentation to Sergeant Karen Thibodeau of the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team in Vancouver. The sergeant had reviewed the account transfers, the numbered company registration, the forensic accountant's report, and the screenshots of Marcus and Derek's messages. She had quietly opened an investigation 3 weeks earlier. She was waiting for the final piece. A confession. Claire had laid a trail for Marcus to follow. A storage locker in Coquitlam, rented under a corporate name that connected back to Claire's firm, where she'd left deliberately incomplete copies of the financial documentation, just enough to make Marcus think there was a paper trail he hadn't found yet. Tremblay had let Derek hear through a mutual contact that an auditor was asking questions about the numbered company. By Thursday evening, Marcus's lawyer had called Claire's firm asking about access to her client files. By Friday morning, Marcus had phoned me. Arthur. His voice was careful, measured. I think we need to talk. All right. There's a storage facility she used for client documents. In Coquitlam. I need to go through what's there before her firm sends someone. Would you come with me? Sunday afternoon. I could use the support. I kept my voice steady. Of course. What time? Gerald Tremblay drove me to the facility on Sunday. Sergeant Thibodeau and 2 members of her team were already in position inside one of the neighboring units. Claire was there too, in the back of a white panel van parked at the far end of the row, watching on a phone connected to a small camera Gerald had mounted above the locker door. I arrived at Unit 114 at 2 o'clock. Marcus was already there, leaning against the corrugated metal door. Derek stood slightly behind him with his hands in his jacket pockets. The 2 of them together, relaxed and proprietary, as if they had already won. Thanks for coming, Marcus said. He unlocked the unit and swung the door open. Inside were 2 filing boxes, a small desk, and a laptop. He turned to face me. "I'll be honest with you, Arthur. I'm not here about Claire's files. I'm here because I need to know how much you know." "What do you mean?" "Someone has been asking questions at her firm. About accounts. About transfers. Her colleague, the one she was close to, she's been talking to people." He watched me carefully. "Did Claire ever mention any concerns to you? Before she died?" "Concerns about what?" His expression shifted, something shedding behind his eyes. "About money. About the accounts. She mentioned her accounts once or twice, in a general way." "Arthur." He stepped closer. "I need you to understand something. Claire's estate is straightforward. The life insurance names me as beneficiary. The RRSP accounts roll to me as the surviving spouse. The house is jointly titled. Everything goes through me, legally and cleanly. There's no reason for anyone to be digging around." He let the words settle. "You understand what I'm saying?" "I think so." "Good." His voice softened into something almost kind. "Because I'd hate for her death to become complicated. For your sake. You're 64. You've already lost Margaret. You don't need investigators at your door, estate lawyers calling, months of delays before you get any of the money she would have wanted you to have." He tilted his head slightly. "I can make sure you're looked after, Arthur. I just need to know we're on the same page, that you haven't been talking to anyone who might make this messy." I looked at him for a long moment. "Who exactly would I be talking to?" "Marcus. Her colleague. The auditor. The RCMP." He said it quietly, but plainly. "Why would the RCMP be involved in an accident?" Something tightened in his face. "They're involved in everything when there's no body. Insurance companies bring them in. It's standard." He held my gaze. "You haven't spoken to anyone, have you? Any investigators?" Derek had drifted slightly to my left without my noticing. I felt the geometry of the moment change. 2 men and 1 exit. "Marcus," I said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "At the memorial, when you leaned over, what did you say to me?" His expression went completely still. "You told me the money was yours," I said. "Every last cent." That's a strange thing to say to a man whose daughter has just died. The stillness in his face became something harder. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Every single word, Marcus." The voice came from behind both of them. Sergeant Thibodeau stepped around the corner of the neighboring unit, and behind her came Claire. The sound Marcus made when he saw my daughter walk out of the shadow of that storage facility was not a word. It was something that came from a place below language, a sound of complete and total system failure. Derek stepped backward and immediately placed his hands on top of his head without being asked, as if some animal part of him recognized that the situation had become very specific very quickly. Marcus could not stop staring at Claire. His face cycled through disbelief, and then fury, and then something that might have been genuine fear. "You're dead," he said. "I'm not." She stopped a few feet in front of him. She was calm in a way that must have cost her something, standing in front of the man who had spent 2 years planning to kill her. "I'm actually very well. And you've been incredibly thorough about explaining yourself." She held up her phone. "The financial documentation is already with the RCMP. The messages between you and Derek have been authenticated. And you just told my father, on a recording, that you needed to know whether he'd spoken to investigators. That wasn't," he looked at Sergeant Thibodeau, "that wasn't a confession of anything." "Marcus Webb," Sergeant Thibodeau said, stepping forward. "Derek Webb, you're being placed under arrest. The specific charges will be read to you now, but they include fraud over $5,000, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and in Marcus's case, criminal harassment." Marcus turned to look at me as the officers moved in. His eyes carried something I hadn't expected. Not defiance, not the cool composure of the man who had stood at that memorial accepting condolences. Something that looked, for just a moment, like the particular humiliation of a person who believed himself to be the smartest person in every room and has discovered, conclusively, that he was not. "You knew," he said to me. "At the memorial. When I whispered, 'I suspected,' I told him. My daughter confirmed it. They put handcuffs on both of them there in the yellow light of a Coquitlam storage facility, and I watched the officers walk them toward the waiting vehicles, and then I turned and looked at my daughter and said nothing at all for a very long time because there wasn't a sentence equal to it. She came and stood beside me, and eventually she said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry you had to do all of this." "Don't be," I said. "Don't ever be sorry for trusting me." We stood there in the winter afternoon, and the clouds over Coquitlam were the color of old pewter, and everything felt both larger and quieter than it had in months. The trial took place at BC Supreme Court in Vancouver the following October. The Crown's case was built on 4 pillars. The forensic accounting that documented exactly $231,000 transferred from Claire's accounts into the numbered company over 22 months. The authenticated message chain between Marcus and Derek that detailed the plan to stage her death. The audio from the storage locker in which Marcus had laid out his awareness of the insurance structure and his need to silence potential witnesses. And the toxicology evidence from the hair samples both Claire and I had provided, which showed traces of a memory-disrupting compound consistent with sustained low-dose exposure. Dr. Huang testified for the Crown about the compound's mechanism and duration. Gerald Tremblay testified about his role in the investigation. Claire's colleague testified about the financial irregularities she had first flagged to Claire 18 months before the staged accident. And Claire herself testified for nearly a full day, steady and precise, walking the court through every step of what she had discovered and what she and I had chosen to do about it. I testified about the whisper at the memorial, about the dinner visits and the tea, about the way certain weeks had felt blurred and unreachable, about the text message and the meeting at the coffee shop on Kingsway and my daughter sitting across from me in a hood and sunglasses, alive. Marcus's defense argued entrapment. The judge dismissed the application. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Marcus Webb received 14 years on the fraud charges, with an additional 12 years consecutive for the conspiracy and attempted murder charges. He will not be eligible for parole for 18 years. Derek Webb received 7 years for his role in the financial scheme and the conspiracy. When the verdicts were read, I looked at Marcus. He was staring at the surface of the table in front of him. He did not look at me, and he did not look at Claire. He had become, in the space of that courtroom, very small. The judge allowed Claire and me both to speak before sentencing. I am not a man who makes speeches. I stood and I said what I actually meant, which is the only kind of speaking I've ever known how to do. My daughter trusted me with something that required more courage than I knew I had, I said. And I am grateful every day that I was the kind of father she could trust with it. That's all I have. Claire spoke after me. She thanked Sergeant Thibodeau and Gerald Tremblay and her colleague and Dr. Huang. She addressed the court's concern about the staged accident and acknowledged the resources the RCMP had expended in the initial search. She accepted a fine for the administrative violations associated with faking her disappearance, which the judge had agreed to settle without criminal record given the exceptional circumstances. When it was over, we walked out of the courthouse onto Hornby Street, and the October air was cold and clean, and the North Shore mountains were dusted with early snow above the city. "Coffee?" Claire asked. We found a place a few blocks from the courthouse and sat at a window table and ordered 2 large, and didn't talk about the trial, or Marcus, or Derek, or any of it for a while. We talked about Christmas plans and whether I needed the furnace in the Gilmore house looked at before winter, and whether Claire was going to stay in the West End or look for something further east with a bit more space. She's looking at Burnaby, as it happens, not far from where she grew up. Eventually, she said, "I keep thinking about Mom." "Me too." "She would have figured him out before the wedding," Claire said. "She had that thing. She could read a room by the time she hit the doorway. She would have said there was something rehearsed about him." Claire looked at me. "Did you think that?" "I did," I said. I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like an old man who couldn't let go of his daughter. "You should have said it." "I know." I looked at my coffee. "I know that now." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine for a moment, the way her mother used to. Then she took it back, and we sat there in the warm cafe with the traffic moving outside on Hornby Street and the mountains in the distance holding their early snow. People sometimes ask me if I would do it again. If I would stand in a community center listening to someone speak at my daughter's memorial, knowing she was alive, knowing it was performance and strategy, and the most frightening thing I had ever participated in. If I would sit across from a man who had been slowly poisoning my memory over months of family dinners and tell him, "Yes, I understand, we're on the same page," I would do it again without hesitation. Because Claire called me from a furnished apartment in New Westminster on a January night with 2 weeks until her staged accident, and she said, "Dad, I need you to trust me completely. I need you to be the one person who knows." And I said yes before she had finished the sentence. The same way I said yes when they put her in my arms in the maternity ward at Burnaby General 39 years ago. The answer to my daughter has always been yes, whatever comes with it. Margaret used to say that family isn't the people you were born to. It's the people you choose to believe in when believing is the harder option. I spent a long time after she died wondering if that was true, or if it was just the kind of thing people say to make loss feel meaningful. I know now that she was right. She usually was. Claire is training for a half marathon this spring. She calls me on Sunday mornings from whatever coffee shop she stops at after her long run. Every week without fail. The calls last longer now than they used to. We have more to talk about, I suppose. Or maybe we always did, and we simply didn't know yet how little time is guaranteed to any of us. Last Sunday she called from a place in Burnaby, not far from Gilmore. She said the neighborhood reminded her of growing up. She said she'd seen a unit for sale in a building 2 streets over from mine. I told her the furnace had just been serviced, and there was room in the driveway if she needed it. She laughed. It sounded like her mother. "I'm still here. My daughter is still here." In the end, that is the only sentence that matters, and I will say it for as long as I'm given breath to say it. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had to fight to protect someone you love, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what you would have done. And if you want to hear more stories about the price of betrayal and what family can survive when it chooses to trust each other, please subscribe. Some stories need to be told. This was one of mine.